Good morning, everybody. This is Jordan Tremaine, and welcome to the Perspective Podcast, where we explore new thoughts, connect ideas, and offer perspectives that may change the way you think about a thing or two. And today, we're talking about learning early. Okay, so today I don't think we're really going to dive into too many definitions, as I have been known to do in the past, and I will continue to do in the future when I guess it calls for it. But today I think the concept isn't necessarily rooted in the semantics of a word or the definition of a word, but more kind of some food for thought. And the topic for today is learning early, and it breaks down into a couple of points, but ultimately, I wanted to bring out the importance and kind of stress in an encouraging way, hopefully to give permission, if you've listened to the podcast on permission, the importance of learning things, but in particular, learning things as early on in your life as possible. And I think if you are in a place of authority where you are in charge of the youth, if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you have any influence over the youth, I would say the biggest thing that you could do for them, or even for the society, is not necessarily shove a bunch of knowledge into their head, but give them the tools and the inspiration and the encouragement to learn themselves. I think there's a big difference between us as caretakers or parents or teachers telling people what to learn and trying to force people to learn, and this is for children in particular, and that being opposed with us providing the tools, providing the space, providing the time and encouragement, and then support if they need it, if they have questions or this or that. I think the latter is much more effective, and it brings people to much closer to being the type of person that is learning rather than the type of person that is being trained. I'll do that in a different podcast, but I think there's a big difference between teaching someone and training someone. And when you teach someone, they have to do a lot more work, and I think they get a lot more value out of it. But anyways, in terms of learning early, I think the main concept is when you learn something, let's pick something like arithmetic. Let's say there's a person that is 5 years old when they learn arithmetic, and I'm just going to assume they learned all of arithmetic when they were 5. And then there's a person who's 25 when they learned arithmetic. This is an example. There's a lot of different ways you can go with different examples. I'm just using this one because I feel like it'll paint a good picture. But in terms of when you learn arithmetic, I think it is the same concept no matter what age you learn it at. But I think there is a very high benefit for learning arithmetic when you're 5 as opposed to when you're 25, not only because you get to enjoy the benefits of using your knowledge for 20 extra years, but those 20 years you spent doing different things and experiencing different things and learning different things. And most learning requires previous learning or prerequisites. And if you do not have the prerequisite at the time or the opportunity to learn presents itself, then you might miss that opportunity. And so I feel the younger you learn something, especially something fundamental to many other things like arithmetic, it gives you time to practice it more, incorporate it more into your fundamental base of knowledge, and to think through that lens and discover and develop different worldviews than you may have developed without it. This in particular what I'm trying to get at might be a little bit subtle, but if you grow up knowing something as opposed to not knowing something, what you know or what you are aware of shapes the way you view the world, shapes what you think is possible, and shapes how you behave. And I would say that when you limit the things that you know, or you kind of gerrymander, like you control the things you know and you make them only one way, kind of this idea of someone growing up sheltered where they only learn a certain few things and other things are not taught to them, kind of like the Buddha. It can be very shocking or disconcerting later in life to learn those things later rather than earlier, because you spent all this time developing your worldview and your reality and your behavior based on what you did know at the time. And if you knew more, you might have developed an entirely different psychology or an entirely different worldview or an entirely different coping mechanism just from knowledge, not necessarily from experience, even though I know experience and knowledge, they're very hard to differentiate, I think, once you get really into it. But I think when you learn stuff early, it allows it to sit in your head and it allows it to incorporate with more ideas because you have more time with that concept in your head. And what I think is also very interesting and very important about learning early is that when you are young, the amount of things in your head are low as opposed to when you are older. As you get older, more and more experiences, more and more knowledge is put through your mind, and there develops this noise and this chatter that you have to contend with as you get older and older, because you have all these experiences. When you're 5, I would say you experience nostalgia much less than when you're 30 because you don't really have as many memories when you're 5. And so when you're young, your mind is more calm. It may be more empty, so it's harder to connect to things because you haven't had time to learn. But it doesn't have heartbreak. It doesn't have as much anxiety. It doesn't have pressure put on it, hopefully, if you're growing up in a stable environment. And so it's the time to learn while you're kind of in the training phase of your life where the handicap wheels are on, because you don't have to get a paycheck. You don't have to worry about where your food's going to come from. Hopefully, I'm assuming that you're a child being brought up in a place where there's food and shelter and, caring guardians and stuff like that. But when you learn things in environments that you're able to focus in or that you are less distracted in, I think you are apt to learn them better or more deeply, and also you have more time to think about it and connect it to ideas and play around with it. I think lastly, in terms of building the simple concept of learning early, one thing that I think is of crucial importance as a person is learning, but not only the ability to learn. I think a very important type of learning is unlearning. And that may sound a little weird to say, but not every idea or concept that enters your head is correct or useful or acceptable to what you need to do with your life. And sometimes, especially when you're little, you learn things and you don't have enough experience to understand that what you're learning is not true or not useful. And being able to recognize, unlearn, and then learn new things is, I think, a very big part of growing, and it's not something that we teach in school. I never came across a single activity during my entire public or university school time where I was purposely given false information and I had to unlearn it in order to move on, which I think would have been a very frustrating, a very memorable, and a very useful activity for me to go through, like in middle school or something, or maybe they taught us something for a few weeks and then they were like, that's not true, we've got to learn the real thing. Because that happens in real life all the time, and I think that would have been a very significant lesson. But I do think of unlearning as a type of learning, because you are moving forward with your total knowledge base. And I think to get to the point where you are competent enough or have enough in your head where it's a thing where you have to unlearn, you have to know a good amount of things. You have to know, I would think, usually you know a language, you know some ideas, you know some customs, you know some culture, and as you learn more things and experience different ideas and concepts and people and cultures, then you start getting an idea of what you want to keep and what maybe you need to work on a little bit. But what I'm bringing this up for in terms of learning early, when I'm talking about unlearning, is I think it is much easier to unlearn something when you are younger. And so if you're on this learning quest and you're doing a lot of learning when you're young, you can make mistakes and unlearn, and there's not as much habit to reinforce what you're doing. There's not as much stress to provoke coping mechanisms, which I think a coping mechanism is a type of habit that you fall into when you're stressed out. But there's less dynamic forces that are encouraging you to not look at yourself and not humble yourself and unlearn things. And so I think when you're younger, it's much easier to do that, and you can take the time to stop your whole life and take a summer off and look at yourself or something like that, because you don't have a job. You're a kid. And so in terms of learning early, I think if you can at all, if you're like a 5-year-old listening to this podcast, learn as much as you can and just shove as many ideas into your head as you can. Think about them. Really say, do I agree with this? That's something I think at some point you get old enough to realize that you have to validate the things in your head. But the more you learn, the faster you learn. I think the earlier you reach that point, and then you start being able to like have a garbage detector and say like, oh, what you said is not good, so I'm gonna disregard that. And the younger you can do that, I think it's more awesome. So as if you're a young person listening to this, like already kudos to you for listening to podcasts, but it's so important in terms of developing the way you see the world and what you think is possible and what you think is part of your world and what you think is foreign to your world. There's an idea in child psychology that up to a certain age, which I forgot what that age is, but when you learn of something, it becomes a natural part of your world. But after a certain age, after you get so old, maybe like 5 or 10 or something like that, the new things that you learn after that time, it's like your worldview kind of has solidified as to what you think is possible. So if you learned about the internet when you were 25, the internet is something you know about, but it's not a part of your worldview because you grew up without it, and it's a new thing that you're trying to incorporate into your world. It's not just a part of the way things are. And that can be very helpful in navigating different things, where that one concept where you think it's just the way things are, as opposed to it's something new that you're trying to add to your life that already exists, or add to your way of thinking that already exists. It's just a part of the way you think. And then to go to the older people that are not young, but may have some influence over the younger people, in terms of encouraging them to learn or giving them the resources to learn. I alluded to this earlier, and I think I'm going to do a podcast about it later, but I think being careful to foster as much critical thinking and as much self-awareness and self-learning as possible, instead of trying to teach specific things, is important and admittedly frustrating. I think when you foster young minds to be critical thinkers, they will question everything. They will be very difficult to deal with and to satisfy, and they will be exhausting. And so it can be very tempting to say, do this because I said so, or because I'm the parent, or because I will hit you if you do not do it, and to not really stroke their critical thinking engine. But when you do that, you kind of rob that child of an opportunity to think, or to wonder, or to guess and check. And you teach them something rather other than thinking, like don't ask questions, or you'll get a punishment. And those type of lessons can run very deep into someone's life, very late into their life, and they may have a lot of struggle with the unlearning, or they may never unlearn it. So in terms of how you teach and what you teach and why you're teaching, I think trying to lean more towards allowing a space to exist where the youth and even yourself can experiment with different ideas and fail, understand why they failed, and move on. It's like, that's, I think, how you grow the most, and that's how you learn the most, and that's how you incorporate all the subtle nuances and learn how to listen to different arguments and become like a real useful member of society. There's a term called autonomous, and an autonomous human is one that is capable of taking care of themselves and making their own decisions and facing the consequences of their own decisions. And as an example, like, babies are not autonomous because they can't make their own decisions and they can't take care of themselves. And like that, very old people also are at a risk for losing their autonomy. But I think the goal of rearing or raising children is to create autonomous humans, people that can be responsible for themselves, people that can actually understand what they're doing and be responsible for their consequences of their actions. And this can get a little fuzzy sometimes, but ultimately, I think that if somebody can understand what they're doing or understand the consequences of potential actions, they are much more likely to conduct themselves in a way to elicit good consequences. And I think there are a lot of times where situations get very confusing or very complicated because people's lives get very complicated, and the consequences of acting a certain way in a situation get very complex, and your ability to critically think, your ability to access good information and act on good information consistently can be very helpful in navigating difficult, complex situations. So that's a little bit on learning early. Today's rant is brought to you by Jordan's Mind. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope if you have access to influencing children, that you do that in a very responsible way, where you allow them to fail, you allow them to ask questions, and the endless why, but what about this, and like, just answer the questions as much as you can. And if I can give one piece of advice to people that have some sort of care over children, it's please, if you don't know, just admit it. I think when you never admit that you're wrong, it teaches kids that adults cannot admit that they're wrong, and then they do that when they grow up. But when you say, like, I don't know, let's go figure it out, it's like so much more welcoming, and it creates a conversation, and maybe you'll learn something too. So this has been the Perspective Podcast episode on learning early, and I hope you guys learn stuff as early as you can. Don't put stuff off till later, because if you learn it now, you get to have it during the whole time. And if you learn it later, you miss out on it and all the good times. Like, if you wanted to learn guitar and you don't learn it for another 20 years, you missed out on 20 years of doing something great and having friends that play guitar and writing songs and maybe performing. And in 20 years maybe you'll learn guitar, but if you had done it now, like in 20 years you'll be like really good at guitar. And you'll have missed out on all that opportunity. So I encourage you guys, if there's something that you're passionate about, or something that you've dreamt about, or something that you've wanted to do, just go and do it. I promise you, you don't have to spend $100,000 to get into most activities. If you really think about it, you can try and do something for a very low budget or a low time cost, but just start, learn, try, and start failing as early as you can, as often as you can, but safely. Don't do anything too dangerous and like get your foot chopped off or something like that. But get out there, do stuff, and learn, and get dirty. And hope you have a good day. All right.